So welcome, everybody. I'm Sarah Catania, Director of Journalism School Partnerships with the Solutions Journalism Network. It's great to be here with you all today at this featured ONA19 session, Founders and Firsts. Feel free to tweet. The hashtag for this session is Happy 20th ONA. We're also live streaming the session, so if you look up the ONA main account, you can retweet the live stream. So if there is anybody else you think might be interested who couldn't make it here today. We have a packed and fast-paced hour for you with 5 of the incredibly foresighted people who made ONA possible. So I'm going to talk to them. I'm going to introduce them in groups and talk to them about the specific work they did at the beginning of ONA, and I'll introduce them as we go along. We've been working really hard to prepare the session so we can chat insightfully, but also leave time for your questions. And before we jump in, I'm really curious to know, of those of you who are here today, who remembers the first time when you heard about ONA? The year, the platform, the person. Does anybody, can you bring to mind that moment? You remember it? Raise your hand if you remember. Like, was it a person? Did you read about it somewhere? Did you see something on Twitter? Great. What was it? Someone shout it out. Where were you?
Twitter was not Twitter.
Oh, so how did you first hear about it?
No.
It's really good to see you, my friend.
It's good to see you.
We need to go to a Giants game. That's right.
A pointer column, okay. So a column. Anybody else? Yes. A conference in San Francisco. Internet world. Someone said there's this guy named Rich Yaroslavsky who wants to start an online news organization.
Oh, that's Tom Reagan.
Yeah.
Wonderful. So another person here from the very beginning. Anyone else remember? It doesn't have to be a long time ago. It could be last year. Sir, you over here. From the International Journalism Festival in Perugia. That's where you've heard about ONA. Wonderful, wonderful. Yes?
I'm having trouble remembering, which is probably a sign of something.
This gentleman is having trouble remembering, which is probably a sign of something. Yes?
I think I probably came up with it first, a pointer.
A pointer. Thank you, pointer.
Who were involved.
Mm-hmm.
There's also one of my former bosses at the BBC who've been involved in a small way as well.
Great, wonderful. All right, so different ways, different places, people have heard about ONA and were able to sort of see and recognize something. So the second question I have for you is, who in this room feels like in some way, somehow, ONA has helped you with the credibility of the work that you're doing? In whatever your area of work is, you feel like it's helped you? Anyone, raise your hand. Okay, someone who hasn't spoken. How has it helped you with your credibility? I saw someone over here. Just shout it out. How has it helped with the credibility for you? Yes, you raised your hand.
I'm trying to figure out how to answer the question.
Uh-huh.
Makes you smarter about the stuff you're doing.
It makes you smarter about the stuff.
Ideas from the quote.
It makes you smart about the stuff you're doing and gives you ideas to steal. That's perfect. All right, and then the last question I'll ask you, and then I'm going to introduce the panelist, is who here feels that ONA has helped you feel a sense of community in the work you do? Raise your hand.
Yeah.
Feel like ONA has helped you. All right, that's wonderful. Okay, thank you. Now, the reason I asked you these things is because in talking with these folks you're about to meet, and it sounds like many of you already know the wonderful speakers we have here today, and in preparing for this session, the themes that I heard over and over from the very beginning of ONA right up through today are credibility and community. At the heart of ONA, driving its founding and informing its central role in journalism now and into the future. And with that, I'm delighted to introduce to you 2 of the founders, 2 of the people who were thinking about this long before most of the rest of us, Elizabeth Oster, principal of the Oster Group, and Rich Yaroslavsky, vice president for content and chief journalist for Smart News. Now, as with everyone you're going to hear from here today, Elizabeth and Rich have deep and impressive bios, and I encourage you to learn all about them in your ONA program guide. And so we're just going to jump right in to some questions for Elizabeth and Rich, and then we'll, once they've talked through some of the things that we're going to discuss, I'll introduce you to the other folks up here. So Elizabeth, you describe the people who started ONA as, quote, either the leaders or the misfits of the existing world of journalism, close quote.
Well,
Where do you see yourself fitting into that at the beginning?
Well, I think, you know, when I think of my colleagues and just what the world was then, there was an incredible, powerful world of journalism and conferences and places where we, as people in this world, didn't fit and weren't really welcome. And so those of us who were working in online news, however we got there, whether we jumped or were pushed, or however it went, we were in this together, and we had to find colleagues amongst us to answer questions, to navigate a new world where we didn't know how to solve problems, and we needed to think about problems that would come and how we'd solve them. So for me personally, we all have the moments we entered it. I was young in my career. I was a photojournalist, and I didn't think I was that good at it. So I found out about this online thing, and I had a chance to do it, and I shifted course by working at the Poynter Institute as part of my master's project, and gave me a chance to do a business plan for what the St. Pete Times would be online. And I went to graduate school in unemployed photojournalists, and I came out the other end a leading authority of what news would be online, which is something we've all made a cottage industry out of talking about for the last 20 years.
So one of the things I love about this, and when Elizabeth and I were talking, and I was talking to Rich, I really saw a beautiful contrast in your experience and in Rich's experience. So you were in journalism, and you were sort of pursuing a certain path, and you weren't super satisfied with how it was going. And then you saw this new world, this opportunity, and you were like, that, right? And so Rich, you were at the Wall Street Journal, where you'd achieved your dream of being a Washington, D.C. correspondent at an early age. Over the next few years, you became increasingly interested in the online world and the possibilities for news. How did that lead to ONA for you?
Well, in my case, I literally had one ambition in my entire life, which is that I wanted to be a Washington correspondent by the time I was 30. And through total fluke, I got to Washington at age 22. And so I'd achieved it. So I figure it was all gravy after that. And when WSJ.com came along, I'd already been in Washington for a long time, and I'd been, had a great run at the Journal, the print paper. And basically, having achieved that ambition so early, I was able to look at things and go, well, this might be interesting or fun. And that's kind of why I got into it in the first place. But after having done it for 4 or 5 years and been in the online realm, I was getting tired of having to justify what I was doing.
Yeah.
The attitude that the medium was inherently uncredible and it wasn't real journalism. And the traditional quote unquote media didn't know what to make of online. And that really kind of ate at me for quite a while, because I knew what we were doing was journalism. I knew we were trying to create a new form of journalism. And instead of embracing it, there was a lot of resistance back then, which seems now, when I talk to younger people, to be totally crazy to them. But it was absolutely true.
So back then, what we're talking about is 1999. So that's 20 years ago, right? So the founding, so let's imagine, okay, so the founding has happened. Rich and Elizabeth have found each other. They've helped make this thing. It exists in the world. And then, Elizabeth, you were on the board for the first half dozen or so years, through the birth, through the early growing pains. What would you say during that time was the toughest decision you had to make?
Well, I'll use my minute to have a couple of them, I think, in there, and I'll quote our former president, Michael Silverman, in the audience, who reminded me this morning about the fact that, and it's significant for people to know, which is the decision to make it a membership organization rather than one that was joined by various media companies. And if that's one thing he reminded me of today that's made ONA unique, that we are not here because we work someplace. We are here because we do something very special and we want to be part of that. And that was a wonderful reminder today that trumped some of my other ideas. But I think the key decisions that were quite difficult were, on a humorous note, I mean, when we learned that the Ontario Nurses Association already had the URL ONA.org, we had to search out a new one, so journalist.org was born that way.
Not a bad alternate.
Okay. I'd say I was in charge of the nominating committee for the birth in the early years, and we controlled how the board happened. And the idea that we would not go to a voted board was something that, to this day, I feel strongly about, and we protected very heavily in the early years, because as an organization to sustain itself, we needed the people that were going to do the work, and we didn't have anybody working for us. We all had half-time to full-time additional jobs birthing this thing. It was a lot of work. So we needed to find the people who could bring the money, the leadership, the credibility in order to stand the organization up. And then two quick follows on that. One is the fact that a lot of people, when we got started, they wanted things from us. Why aren't you international? Why don't you have an educators group? All these things people wanted from us, and we could only scale as quickly as we could. So things like keeping the educators alive as sort of a passion project was important until it could get set up as actually a team. And the last project was the time we grew as an organizational place where I remember, I still have it in my garage, we had to build an org chart with roles and responsibilities and groups of people to handle membership and awards, and all of a sudden we went from 8 friends sitting around sorting some stuff out to getting it done. And then the last thing I don't want to forget is I think that the amicus briefs and things that we did to get access for online journalists to events was really not an important thing, but really at the core of why we had to get together and get our credibility. So sorry if I went on too long.
So those early years, yeah. So those early years, like from nothing to something to everything, and then everyone wanted everything, and there was so much that kind of you were trying to incorporate into that. Rich, so for you, what would you say, to your mind, was the single most important moment in those early years?
I would agree with Michael's point about it, being an association of like-minded individuals. Most of the people that I invited to the first meeting were leadership-type people because that's who I knew. They were my peers. But that decision to not be corporate but to be more inclusive was very much an important issue. I remember, it was debated, well, what if Matt Drudge wants to join? And would we really accept somebody like Matt Drudge as a member? And my answer to that was, if we do our jobs right, Matt Drudge will never want to join this organization. But if he does, we will welcome him.
So inclusivity was an important, to you that was the most important moment in the
I think that was, and the idea of learning to walk before we tried to run, which as much as anything I think was a reflection of my own risk-averse personality. This was at a time when other organizations, I remember particularly the New York New Media Association, which was expanding so rapidly, and it felt like we were just sort of plodding along. But when the nuclear winter hit, it turned out that plodding along was a much better strategy for long-term survival.
So there was a method to the madness in the early years. It was actually a very deliberative process, even though it might have not seemed that way to everyone. You could see it, and you understood this foundational moment.
I was, by nature, I'm kind of conflict and risk averse, and it turned out that turned out to be a virtue under the circumstances.
All right, great. So I'd like to turn now to the surveyors. This is Martha Stone Williams. She is CEO of World News Media Network, and Howard Finberg, digital futurist and digital futurist consultancy. So please welcome Howard and Martha. Great to have you here. So a little bit of background, because you have to kind of take yourself back to 20 years ago. There really wasn't a lot of information about what online news was or what its impact might be. So with some funding from the Knight Foundation, thank you, Knight Foundation.
Yay, Knight.
ONA commissioned Martha and Howard to conduct a landmark study. It was the first of its kind on credibility of online news. So Howard, why don't you start us off here? Why did you want to do this study, and what was the most important finding?
Well, I actually have a copy of the study, so
Great.
there's proof. I think one of the drivers for me in terms of trying to do this study, in addition to recognizing its importance to ONA, is the industry itself. A lot of journalists had a large skepticism about online media, and that the idea that there was this whole other way of communicating to an audience directly, not through intermediaries, I think the journalists, many of them, struggled with the whole concept of online news. And so the idea was that if we could do a good comprehensive study, we could give them both a benchmark for the way the world is and provide guidance to the way forward, so they have some tools in which to think about the changing technological world, the changing needs of consumers, and the nature of what online news is.
So you were hopeful that the survey would support that.
Yes, I'm ultimately an optimist, even though I think the world's going to hell. But
we'll save that conversation for another day.
And there was another aspect of it, in that credibility in the news industry has always been an issue for print, for television, but especially for print. And I looked at some Gallup numbers, and back in the 70s, 70% of consumers trusted their media, trusted news media. But if you go back to 2000, just before the study was started, that number had dropped to 50%.
So just let me reiterate this. This was in the year 2000. This was before online news really was widespread. It wasn't the primary source of news and information for most people. And journalism already was suffering a pretty intense credibility problem at that time. Okay. So what was the key finding from this survey?
Well, the key finding was that there was a large opportunity that that media companies, all media companies, had in terms of making the consumer feel that online news was credible, more credible as traditional media, perhaps in ways that we couldn't have imagined at the time, but in terms of what the audience was looking for, that they were open to the idea that their online news sources would be the credible news source they could turn to, which made a lot of traditional journalists, and frankly made a lot of leadership in news organizations very apprehensive, because they didn't understand it, and if I don't understand it, I'm going to fear it, and that's a struggle, And probably one of the more striking findings was that, remember, this is 2001 is when we did the study. Just to put it in perspective, Facebook didn't exist, okay? Didn't open to the public until 2006, and Google News didn't exist until 2002. So with that perspective, 13% of the consumers that we surveyed saw online news as their most trusted source. And that was a fairly striking realization, that the consumer was maybe a little ahead of what the industry was and what the journalists were.
But the people surveyed were people who were maybe more
they were definitely more forward-looking.
Yeah, so the group of, it was what, 1,500?
1,500 journalists.
Journalists.
And about 1,100 consumers.
And 1,100 consumers, okay. So Martha, you were working a lot on credibility for online journalists at that time. And it was quite a struggle. You were describing that to me. Did this survey change anything?
Well, I think, like everybody here on the panel is talking about putting this in context, because now if we would impose these questions on the world today and on journalists today, I think that the findings would be flip-flop probably. I guess that's just my gut reaction. That's just off the top of my head, but I sense that that's true because of all of the new players swirling about that are not credible and how we're tied into them, like Facebook and Google, for example. But I think that what we found in the study really tied into anecdotal evidence about what was happening in newsrooms at that time. So during that time, I was the training director of the Newsplex newsroom of the future. And during that time, we would
Can you say that again, the
Newsplex
Newsroom of the Future. That sounds
at the University of South Carolina, but it was also, it was owned by IFRA, the big association of newspapers at the time based in Germany. And then they started their own Newsplex there too. Basically, it was a training center for teams of journalists at a time, teams from the very same company. And at that time, the whole idea was to get people used to the idea of working together across platforms, which was the impossible dream at that time. I know all of you probably have done this, been there, done that. It's not an issue right now, but again,
and the timeline for that was like the early 2000s.
Early 2000s.
The early 2000s, you were already trying, you're really working in this kind of laboratory setting to bring all these different parts together, to bring what we now think of as legacy or traditional journalists together with digital journalists, although those names didn't quite exist at that point.
Right.
And that was like,
it was
not an easy thing to do.
It was where the rubber hit the road. This is basically the credibility study in action. And so it didn't matter where these teams were from. They could have been from Europe. We had teams from Europe, Asia, North America, South America. It didn't matter. They all had the same visceral reaction to working together. That is, TV people with newspaper people with the dreaded online people.
Yeah.
And when that happened, there was one team from the UK, company shall remain nameless, that came, and they were represented across platforms. And I still remember they almost came to fisticuffs because they were so opposed to working with one another. They were so not aligned with journalistic guidelines and principles, and therefore the traditional journalists did not respect the online journalists. And because of all, and that was just sort of a reflection about what we learned from the study, it was really the journalists were having problems with the credibility, not the audience necessarily.
Yeah, it's very interesting.
The audience pretty much embraced this new medium, and we're starting to get used to the idea.
And if you think about it today, Howard, I'm wondering, this survey is nearly 20 years old now. Do you think there'd be any value? I mean, credibility is still a huge question, probably an even bigger question now. Do you think there'd be any value in revisiting it now?
Oh, absolutely. But I think that's, that the whole idea of continuing to look at issues like credibility and ethics and how to be effective and consumer involvement are, things that you have to do constantly. You just can't say, okay, here's a study and nothing has changed. And so the whole idea of going back and taking another look at this, I think it's so important for not only traditional, online media that might have its roots from traditional organizations, but the force full of online-only organizations that, in terms of looking at credibility and things that are important, provide guidance as to how they can do their own jobs better and provide guidance in terms of what their consumers want are a broad spectrum of consumers. Like you said, the early adopters embraced it. Now, what about the rest of the world? I mean, the Pew people just did a study talking about how there's been a lot of movement away from thinking about news on Facebook as being credible. Okay, can we go deeper into figuring that out and what its implications mean? I think, and there's one more point I'd like to raise about one of the aspects of the study that I think that some people took advantage of in terms of understanding how to move forward was the guidance provided in terms of the workforce. 1,500 journalists were interviewed, surveyed, and when you looked at what their responses were as to the importance of aspects of online, I mean, they had a big disconnect from what the audience wanted. So everybody was pretty clear across consumers and the media workers that updates were very important. But the public wanted accuracy at a higher level or a higher rate than the journalists, believe it or not.
That's so interesting.
And the journalists thought that the brand of the organization was actually more important than the consumers, which means, in my mind, that's why a lot of these new brands and new ways of getting news and information have actually flourished, because the consumers don't see the brand, the media brand, as being as essential as things like accuracy, timeliness, and navigation was another area.
Those are some great points that you raise, and it's really interesting to think about. You know, you're describing kind of a misalignment. You know, as journalists, we think we know, we have the idea. You know, our brand is, you know, important to the credibility, whereas what you're saying is, well, for other journalists, maybe not so much for people outside in the world. That's very interesting. Now, Martha, you did mention early adopters, which I think is interesting. You know, Martha, your work today is focused, and we want this panel to be about the past, but also about the future. Your work now is focused on artificial intelligence. What should ONA, what would you say, as someone who's really immersed in this world, what would you say ONA should be doing in this realm?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we need to go back to the drawing board and draw up new guidelines. I'm actually working with the World Economic Forum right now on drawing guidelines, AI ethical guidelines for the media industry. With them, they have a unit actually in San Francisco where they focus on only technological matters as it relates to forum issues. And the reason this is important is because all of the artificial intelligence projects that are going on may touch us in the media industry, and or we may be creating our own AI-driven projects, but we have to make sure that whatever we touch needs to adhere to ethical guidelines that are very similar to what our guidelines are today for journalism.
Did you say you're working on developing these ethical guidelines right now?
We're in the process
of will those be available that everyone?
Yeah, and in fact, the frameworks actually is made available to everyone as a handout. It's just a short handout, but it gives you an idea of what we're up to. But I think that this is really important, especially with the elections coming and undoubtedly more Russian interference and that sort of thing. It's definitely going to affect us, but it's how we react and how we build our AI-driven projects that matters. And one of the things that I work on now is research on innovative practices that include AI in media companies around the world. That's what I've been focusing on for the last 7 years. And one of the major trends, as many of you know, is that people are working in project teams. So one of the things that actually we all can work on right now is when we create products that have an AI component, we really must make sure that the journalists in the product team get very vocal about the technology that's being implemented, the AI-driven technology that's being used in that project. And we can't let the technologists just drive that because there's too much at stake that impacts our journalism.
So this is a really great point, and I just want to reiterate it because I think it's a through line with so much of the work that ONA does and so much that's really important about this conference being a gathering space for people who work on this from all sides, right? So what you're saying is that the people who have sort of come up through the journalism and through the work of being a journalist really need to partner with and be working very closely with the people who are creating the experience, right? And that needs to be a really strong partnership. I mean, that's a great point. I do want to go now to our final panelist here, last but not least, the celebrator, as I call him, Sri Srinivasan, co-founder of Center 10 Consulting, and as of this month, the Marshall Loeb Visiting Professor of Digital Journalism, Digital Innovation in Journalism and Audience Engagement at Stony Brook University. So welcome. We're really happy to have you here with us. So let me set the stage. You were 20 years ago, 1999, a professor at Columbia University, which had the legacy of Columbia and journalism is that nearly a century earlier played a key role in legitimizing journalism itself by accepting an endowment from Joseph Pulitzer and founding one of the nation's first journalism schools. And now here you were at this very place seeking to legitimize online journalism by having the school host the first ever awards for online journalism. How did that come about?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me here, and I'm delighted to be in this audience and back at ONA. I've been out of journalism for 6 years, and suddenly this week I'm back in journalism, so this is a perfect place to be back in journalism. And I'm thrilled to be here, especially to see how much it's grown. I didn't catch the number when they said how many people are new at the conference in the morning when they said, but it looked like hundreds of first-timers. Yeah. That means how many of the longer timers are there? So it was just, Rich and Elizabeth and everyone should be super proud of what you've done. It's incredible. I know you feel that as you walk around here, but having been out of journalism, coming back in journalism education. So as a lot of things start in New York, it's with people talking over a drink, and Rich and I spoke about what we could do in terms of recognizing the work of online journalists. And this was a time when you heard all the things we've discussed already. Also, the NCAA wouldn't give online journalists access to cover games if you were not part of a legacy organization. And you fast forward to today, sports organizations are among the most forward-thinking about digital. So that just tells you how hard that was. And we felt that this was a way of legitimizing everything in the online space. And
you'd already had some experience in the Journalism Prize world.
Yeah, in the Journalism Prize world. Journalists love to give prizes, and Columbia loves to give prizes. Yeah. And the Columbia J School is home to the Pulitzer Prizes, as well as the National Magazine Awards and the DuPont Prizes. And I had been involved with the founding of another organization called SAJA, South Asian Journalists Association, which is having its 25th anniversary next month.
Congratulations.
And we also give a lot of awards. So anyway, and the godfather of that organization sitting right there, Peter Bhatia, who is a wonderful mentor to so many of us. Anyway, so as we talked, we thought of how would we do this. So I went down the road down the hall to the Pulitzer office and said, tell us, how do we do this? And interestingly, you would have thought they may have felt some competition, but in those days it was very clearly marked out. If you remember, it was newspapers only and arts, the arts prizes, and National Magazine Awards was only magazines, and DuPont was only television. Right. So they thought this little thing wouldn't matter anyway, and they were very generous in collaborating. And today, all of those awards accept almost any journalism, any media, and that is a result of everything here.
But ONA was kind of the leader in that.
Oh yeah,
right?
it was way ahead.
The first one to sort of open it up to anyone, anywhere, doing anything in the
And one of the things that we were able to do, because we said we have to be new and try to do things differently, was we had an online entry form, which was revolutionary at the time, and now there are great startups that do things like Submittable and Google Forms and all of that stuff. What else did we do? I was very proud that we were trying to do a what do we give as a prize? And so there was a company called awards.com that gave could buy your trophies off of. So we said we'd partner with them and order the trophies. We had an acrylic trophy that I think is similar. I think they still give us some acrylic trophy. What was really important for this to succeed was the credibility, not just of Columbia or of ONA, but the judges of the first round of.
So we had
a culling process where we got 600 entries from 20 countries that first time.
The very first time.
Yep.
This tiny little organization that no one ever heard of, but hey, journalists, there's a prize.
Right.
And all of a sudden you get 600 in
Yeah, and that was also under Rich's guidance that we should make it international in English. We couldn't do other language, we were not ready, but at least let's do it in English. And so all those other prizes I mentioned were all America only. And so this was the ways in which we could be different. So we're trying different vectors.
Again, going back to the founding themes of inclusivity, right? So we're not going to just stop it here. We're going to say anybody who's doing anything that's really interesting in the digital space, come on in and enter this. Yeah.
And then we were able to bring in lots of folks from around the country who helped judge. So we followed the Pulitzer model of a first cut kind of jurors, and then we had the official smaller judging team, including our friend Walt Mossberg was there, which really, again, giving it credibility, and he's not a big fan of prizes, as Rich knows, and so he also, was really keen not to make it log rolling and all these other things that journalists give each other prizes and all that. So people like him, it made a big difference for him to be there. My partner in many Columbia crimes is a guy named Andrew Lee, L-I-H, who is now one of the world's experts on Wikipedia, and he helped set up all the infrastructure for pulling all this together. And
so you really laid, it was almost like, just like ONA itself, you really laid a strong foundation.
Yeah.
You were in the right place. You were at Columbia, so you got the credibility. Then you brought in, you made it very inclusive, and then you brought in a really good and highly credible and highly respected group of judges. So you're just messaging that it's possible to be inclusive and credible at the same time, which is really a nice combination.
As you use the word inclusivity, I should also say one of the great things is not just the raw numbers of people here, but how much more diverse this ONA is from where we started. In that hotel in Chicago where we first met, where 25 of us, I think Jay Singh and I might have been two of the only people of color in the room, where today it's a lot more of people of color and more women, and trying to get more, and that's a conscious thing that is now accepted in journalism, but it wasn't obvious for everyone to do that.
And now what would you say now, if you're thinking about looking at these awards through the years, where we are today, what do you see as the primary function today of the online journalism awards now today? Do you think it's the same? Has it changed?
I think it's, at the heart of it, still the same, recognizing excellence in these awards. I judge something called the Shorty Awards, which some of you might know, the founders of Muckrack run it, and we used to say, honoring excellence in social media, such as it is. And that's become a really big kind of judging, prize thing itself. But Rich reminded me by mentioning Matt Drudge that we had a Matt Drudge encounter as part of the launch of ONA, the award ceremony. So we took there's a photograph that I just tweeted out onto that the main account just retweeted of the first set of winners. And you'll recognize several of the names. Meredith Artley is there, and John Doob, former president of the organization, and Merrill Brown. All kinds of folks are on that in the photograph. But as soon as we took the photograph and I turned around, I got a call on my cell phone. In those days, people would call each other. And I answered the phone, and it says, "Hi, this is Matt Drudge." And I'm like, "Hi, Matt." And he says, because I put my phone number in the press release, and it had gone out on the AP Wire and stuff like that. And I said, hi, and he said, I'm reading this release about the Online Journalism Awards. How come I didn't get the Online Journalism Awards? And I said, you didn't enter, Matt. And he said, why do you have to enter? I am Matt Drudge. And so he kept going on. He talked about his viewership. So I said, everybody's still standing around. And I turned to Rich and said, Matt Drudge is on the phone. He wants to know why he didn't win. And then he said, you have to, I keep saying you have to enter. You can enter next year. He said, what if I put on the site that your phone number and tell all my angry readers that they should call you to blame you for not giving me an award? I said, I prefer if you didn't do that, but, you know,
Oh,
so that was.
doxing you right back then.
Yeah,
Okay,
so
that's
you were
fine.
prescient about how
I was-
quickly that would become
Yeah.
a thing.
Yeah.
But
Interesting.
And I will point out that my recollection of that first conference is a complete blur. But the only two things that I remember are that the only thing I got to eat were potato chip crumbs because, you know, by the time I went for food, it was a luncheon thing, and I regarded that as a really good thing because it meant we had a big enough turnout that we had misjudged the food.
And I'm sure it has nothing to do with the fact that journalists will eat anything.
Well, that's true. You want a journalist to come hang a lamb chop in the window is the old line. But the only other thing I remember of that entire day was listening to Sri's side of the conversation with Matt Drudge, because I was standing right there, and it was like, I was rolling my eyes, and poor Sri was going, but Matt, if you want to win, you really have to enter.
So we're down to our final 15 minutes, and I want to go to audience questions. But before we do that, I do want to ask all of you just a couple questions, and if you just give us, you know, your deepest insights that you can distill into little gems, that would be wonderful. So the first one is, you know, we're thinking about now and the future, right? So what, for each of you, if you could just give us, you know, a quick thought, what do you think is the biggest challenge for ONA right now? Howard, why don't you start? And then we just go down.
Sure.
Biggest challenge for ONA right now. What would you say?
You know, that's a tough question. I think it's a.
You can pass.
I want to sort of frame it. It's the biggest challenge that all organizations have in terms of connecting with audience, but maintaining a level of credibility and standards and bringing the next generation forward.
Okay. All right. Martha, biggest challenge for ONA right now?
I would say there's a micro and a macro. The macro is a sense of community. I mean, we talk about that a lot here. As this organization grows and grows, how do you engender this sort of sense of community? Because that is the heart of any organization, but when your organization grows, it gets harder to do. So create micro communities among the big community and get to work. And because we got a lot of work to do in this industry. And in a micro way, I have to echo what Howard says. I'm neck deep into guidelines for AI-driven journalism and AI-driven media business. And I cannot tell you how important this is in a day and age where trust of the media is at an all-time low. We have to take this seriously, and we have to do something about it. And this is the organization to really grapple with this problem, this deep-rooted problem. This simply has to change in order for us to move forward as an industry.
Okay, Sri, biggest challenge today?
I think it's a challenge and an opportunity. I think there are thousands of journalists who would benefit from being here and being welcomed into an organization and this particular conference, but they will not come because they don't know about it, they don't understand it, they think it's not for them. And how do you bridge that divide? Because I think as the changes in the industry are happening, fewer and fewer people will have a path forward if they don't adjust. We know that. And so they need to know about this. And where's next year's conference? Does anybody know? We should.
Atlanta.
So Atlanta, we should each try to bring
Atlanta.
somehow with scholarships or
Yeah.
not an age-based scholarship, but like some kind of fellowships, bring people there.
Okay, Elizabeth, biggest challenge today for ONA?
Biggest challenge, I think, for ONA at 20 years, looking forward, looking back, is be careful about having created sacred cows now that confine what this world and this is today to what this conference is. Just like we live in a world of sacred cows, the Pulitzers will only be for newspapers, and we have seen over the last 2 decades so many things change. So I say to the leadership of ONA, what are your sacred cows? And maybe how do you need to realign on mission for the next 20 years? And I say that humbly because of the unintended consequences of well-intended actions, which is 20 years of what I thought I did in a career where I thought I had done really, really well and created something maybe great and contributed to this. I also question some things that I've done. And I'll just say with that, this is an amazing conference and an amazing community, but I want to make sure that we don't have a sort of false equivalency to journalism in marketing, journalism in funds from Google and Facebook, and journalism and even, product development, which is I was an audience development and product development executive very, very early on. But I did those jobs and I knew they were marketing, and we just need more feet on the street, we need more reporting, we need more journalism, and we need basically to understand that where that really fits into the programming at ONA. It always exists in the awards, which blows my mind. And I was not into the awards. I was like, I don't want to have awards. I'm not going to do that. So I was not into awards. But
So
today
you're
they
walking the walk.
today
you
they
are-
shine light on the best of the work that happens, and I love that.
That's great.
Anyway, that may have been a lot of stuff, but whatever.
Rich, biggest challenge for ONA today, and then we're going to open it up to your questions. Biggest challenge for ONA today.
As some of you in the room remember, the name Online News Association was the one that I had made up as a placeholder, and when the time came to name the organization, I said, what should we call it? And they said, oh, Online News Association is fine. I had no pride of authorship, but, so the name itself, as has been pointed out to me, is a little bit of an anachronism because all news is online. It's redundant. I think the biggest challenge for ONA going forward is to grapple with what it means that all news is now online, and ONA. How do we reconcile the fact that all news is online news while maintaining focus on what it is that ONA does best?
All right.
There's a little bit of an inherent tension in that.
Okay, so we have 5 big challenges that for ONA moving forward. Homework noted. So before we go to your questions, one quick thing, resources. Rich's History of ONA, Martha's AI Guide, and all their great resources are both on the session page and on the resource page for the conference. So all that stuff is there and available to you. Anyone with any questions for anyone here, any comments? Could you go to the mic, please? And if you could just say your name, where you're from, that would be great.
Yes, I'm Anthony Moore, and I'm from Mountain View, California.
Twitter
home of
handle.
Silicon Valley.
Twitter handle.
Twitter handle is @AJ Moore, which if you've got, like your name, you were early. So I was.
Can you you're tall and the mic is low,
Put it up.
so yeah, that would be great. Or just like stoop down, however you want to do it.
I'll be
There
at
you go.
the Pelican Bar later. So I came late. I came early and then I left and came late. So if you've addressed this, let me know. But I feel like we always had a tension in ONA of being a trade association versus a journalism association. In other words, are we about the tools and the trade of digital journalism, or are we about journalism writ large? And I don't think other organizations in our peer group have the same issue, although some are narrower in focus. It's funny because I've been gone for 6 years. I came back, and I hear that same. I kind of feel the same vibe here. We're still a lot about technology. So just curious for your questions. It kind of builds on what you said, Rich. And if you guys already addressed it, I apologize.
Okay, so trade organization, is it the tools, is it the journalism? Who would like to?
Well, there's so many, my colleagues are very articulate here. I mean, I think I just said it. It's something that's deeply bothered me for years because have done a lot of tools and technology professionally and led in that space, but I look at that as something very, very different that I did in the service of journalism, that I didn't equate with journalism. I think there's a place for both here. I just want to, and I think both are important. Technology is presentation and distribution, and audience engagement is how we react and connect with customers. Those things are inherently important in the supply chain of media today. We have to understand those things, but we shan't lose balance of what it is that we are creating and what we're reporting on and distributing and packaging. And so it's always should be a tension here. I just want to shout out for more alignment with actual creation of content, civic reporting, all the, consumer affairs reporting. There's so many beats that could benefit from what we teach here that I wish that we would sort of cross over more into unique content and furthering the consumptive patterns of those things. So anyway, I'm always like.
Anyone else want to remark on that?
More journalism.
More journalism. All right. Yes, sir.
Yes, hi, Alex Johnson with NBC News, Alex Johnson. I'm going to ask a question I asked 15 years ago at this conference, but from...
I remember that.
Yeah, from the, from the other side of it. And at that time, I asked the question as a way to seek guidance for how to help this organization grow. Now I'm asking it sort of as a devil's advocate, and it goes to what Rich ended with during the presentation there. Now that virtually all journalism is online, how do we explain and justify the need for a segregated online news association?
Anyone?
I'd say that it's because the other types of organizations haven't caught up and haven't done the kind of work that ONA has done to make it self-relevant and useful. I mean, that's why you have so many people here. Most journalism conferences are kind of on the decline, where I feel this is growing. So I think that's one of the reasons. I mean, eventually it will be just news. All news will be just news, and this will be, one of the few that survive. And may still have the name, but like IBM doesn't mean international business anymore, machines anymore. Maybe it'll be just the ONA. And we'd have to guess what it stood for.
Yeah, could I reframe that a little? Because one thing, I've been thinking about this a lot too, and one thing that I think is a very, very important distinction between ONA and other journalism organizations is the tone, and we haven't really talked about that today. But if you go to a lot of conferences, there is a very defeatist tone. And it's not that we aren't in a crisis. We are, right? But it does seem to me that the tone at ONA is about, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, it's more about, all right, well, what do we do about it? And let's look forward and figure it out. So there's a tone difference that may actually have something to do with why the organization draws so many people.
I would just say it's because the people here have the skills to do something about it. And they know what to do, and they also have access to funding. That's also a big difference. The way Knight and other organizations are really putting money into this organization, it's making a difference. And that's why if you aren't here, you may not know what to do, but if you're here, you do.
Well, I think that if you look at the media landscape today and the association landscape, it's always morphing and changing, and in some cases merging and everything. And I think that we just have to be open to the idea that eventually, Rich, we're going to change the name of the organization. It may not be imminent, but there will be a time. And I'll give you some examples of where that happened. And actually, it probably took too long for these other organizations to change the name, but they actually finally did. Good example, International News Marketing Association became International News Media Association. That allowed them a lot more breadth in the organization to expand into other places other than marketing. So strategically it was a good idea, but also it was more reflective of what they had already done, which was they already sent their tentacles in other places in the media industry, and they were just sort of validating what it is that they had, what their new name, was to be. So I think, and there are other organizations that have changed their name as well to reflect their ambitions and their actions. And I think that eventually there might be a name, who knows, I don't know if there would be a name change here, but it will just be obvious to the board at some point, time to change our name.
Well, we're down to our last 2 minutes, and I just really want, since you all were here at the beginning, it's just impossible for me to say goodbye to you without asking you, 20 years from now. I mean, you all were thinking about this so early, and I know there are some others in the room who were too, but honestly, I wasn't thinking about this 20 years ago. I was like, okay, guys, you go ahead and do that, and we'll see what happens, right? So if you could just really, very briefly, 20 years from now, what do you see? And if you say, who knows, that's fine too, but just go down the line, 20 years from now, where will we be?
Come visit me in the home. It's very hard to imagine 20 years from now, but if you look at movies like Minority Report or Blade Runner or things like that, or combination of dystopia futures. There's always some form of information out there. But what it is that we do is not going to change 20 years from now if it's focused on journalism.
Yeah.
All right.
Amen to that, right? You know, it's funny, it's way too far out, I would say that, but if, I don't know if any of you were at the API 2020 seminar, where a bunch of journalists, a bunch of editors got together, maybe, was it 15, 20 years ago, and they predicted, what is 2020 gonna look like for us? Well, they did designs of what newspapers were gonna look like, and it was like, you know, so look what's changed in the last 20 years, obviously. And they were thinking, oh, well, this is what a newspaper's gonna look like. It's ridiculous. So, but what will happen? I mean, certainly we have a lot of work to do to keep journalism alive and in our control and not in the control of, you know, malicious organizations and governments and things like that. With all of the artificial intelligence out there just waiting to control what is served to the public, we need to take control of it before the messages, the news is controlled for us. And I think that's a real general thing, because I don't know what's going to happen, nobody does, but I do think that there's a lot of bad that could happen if we don't take back our journalism and take control of it.
Okay, Sri, 20 years from now.
I think a lot of it will depend what happens in the election of 2020. And there's one scenario where things will be one way, and the other will be if, again, there's interference and all of that elects a second president, partially elects a second president. I think the work of journalists is going to be much more difficult, at least in the United States, and it will continue to give rise to people around the world who are of the same attitude towards, and you know, 20 years ago, if you had said we'd be called the enemies of the press, like by the president of the United States,
right.
It would be impossible. And some ways he'll be more unleashed and against journalism, and to think that he's leashed now is scary.
Elizabeth, 20 years from now.
I love predicting the future because no one ever checks what you say. And I've been
we're
around
running
so long
around.
right now, people could see.
Say it quick, because we're
But if I
coming
was
up at
just
the
to
end.
cut to the quick on it, which is, if I was when I'm ONA, at ONA 20 years from now, God willing, with my walker and my blue hair up here telling the same story, I would hope that I look back at the last 10 years as when ONA became radicalized to be warriors for truth, the First Amendment, and to use the tools, technology, and mission that's here to fight for, in this country, the appropriate place of news and information to play in our democracy. And I think that the community is here to move that needle if we get serious about it in the mission. And that's a little radicalization, but that to me, if the world, I think it's required. And so there's an opportunity for leadership
Right.
here.
Rich, 20 years from now.
Well, the future, by definition, is unknowable. So I can't claim that I have any vision. But the thing that makes me optimistic and the thing that makes me proud about ONA is all those first-timers who stood up this morning, and all the young people who are here and who are on fire for the Lord, for journalism. Those are the people that are going to be building that future. And that's what makes me optimistic about it, and that's what makes me really proud of ONA.
I want to thank all of our panelists and thank all of you for being here today for Founders and First. Thank you very much.